Okay, so here's a preview, a short preview of Book 14. My recommendation, particularly if you're new to the poem, is to preview each chapter to the extent you feel that's helpful for you. All readers are different. I teach mostly students who've never read this before and who maybe don't have a lot of familiarity um, with epic poetry, with Homer, with the sort of value system within the poem. So we just take our time, and if we preview each chapter, we can sort of dive into the language. So this is a preview of Book 14. Odysseus in the last chapter made it home, and we discussed how strange it is that in a 24 chapter text, the goal of the entire poem seems to occur in chapter 13. He returns home, but he's not fully home yet. So whereas in the last chapter, his discussion was with Athena in disguise and then not in disguise, here the chapter Emily Wilson entitles A Loyal Slave. So immediately that implies that Odysseus will have loyal slaves, people that have stayed loyal to him for the last 20 years in his absence, and also conversely, people that aren't. And maybe both will end up playing a part going forward. So I like with my classes to just think about some of the issues that live in each chapter before each chapter begins, and it sort of conditions us to enter into these passages, maybe in a little more personal, heartfelt way. So, because this chapter deals with a loyalty and a connection in Odysseus's life, something I ask my students to consider is who do you feel is the most loyal member of your family or your school or your community or your team? And maybe more importantly, how do you know? How can you tell loyalty? How can you see it? How do you see it play out in other people? So we have a bit of a discussion about that. And secondly, what kind of characters have had a voice so far in the poem? Right? Obviously, we've had multiple councils of the gods. We have certain gods like Poseidon and Athena and Hermes who are here quite a bit. And we have major characters. We had Eurycleia the nurse, have a part to play, but a lot of the people that are doing a lot of the work in these kingdoms, whether it's early on in the first 4 chapters in Pylos and Sparta, or Alcinous, we don't really know what the folks in the kitchen are up to. We don't have a lot of information about the people who take care of pigs. There's a lot of people doing a lot of important things to sustain this world, essential workers, we would call them now, who aren't really relevant. So think about the people who we haven't heard from yet. And that ends up being really important in Book 14. So in Book 14, Odysseus is home in Ithaca. And similar to when he's at the island of the Phaeacians, we don't get right to the meat of the story. There's a process, right? I'm on the beach. I interact with Nausicaa. There's a sort of journey to the throne of Arete and Alcinous. Here, there's a very deliberate sort of re-entry into home. That might be worth thinking about. Why would a man who fought hand-to-hand combat for 10 years and then fought heaven and earth to get back home, why can't he just relaunch into home? So that might be an interesting thing to just consider as you read. In line 36, the swineherd Eumaeus, Odysseus's swineherd, he's part of the staff, right? Odysseus's property and part of the staff, Eumaeus, comes upon Odysseus. Now, Odysseus is in disguise as an old, decrepit beggar, so he doesn't look like himself. And the swineherd says to Odysseus in line 36, "My dogs almost ripped you apart, old man. You would have brought me shame when the gods are hurting me already." And he gets right to it, like the thing that he's thinking about today, 20 years after Odysseus left for Troy. He says, "I am in mourning for an absent master, raising his pigs for other men to eat. My lord is lost and maybe even hungry in lands where the people speak in foreign tongues. If he's still alive, still seeing the sunlight." And then he changes gears. He's reminded of his responsibilities to guests. "Well, now follow me, old man, fill up on food and wine. Tell me where you come from and the troubles you have borne." So we not only have Xenia, we have proper hospitality. And this is from a guy who takes care of pigs. There's been upper class people in this poem who haven't done as well. And then he also just admits to missing his master. He can't really hide his heart. It's really the opposite of Odysseus, right? Odysseus, if he sees it fit that to get what he wants, he needs to hide who he is. He never has a problem. Eumaeus is loyal to Odysseus and is nothing like him. So they have a bit of an interchange. Odysseus thanks him, and if you go to the next page, on page 334, that large stanza in the middle, right around line 53, Eumaeus says to this person who he doesn't realize is Odysseus, he concretizes this idea of Xenia, and he says, one must honor guests and foreigners and strangers, even those much poorer than oneself. Zeus watches over beggars and guests and strangers. Make sure you're marking your book up, because remember, Xenia is the quality Zeus most values in men. And this swineherd is pious. He's following the will of the gods, maybe better than almost every upper class character so far. He's doing it in a really clear, intentional way. He later curses Helen, and because she was the sort of domino that fell, that started the Trojan War, that took this guy's, it all goes back to this guy missing his master, complete loyalty. And he ends up at the end of this passage on line 100, delineating, and I think this is a weird thing to include, and this is one of those moments where a new reader, it's sort of like when you read a 19th century novel and you have a sad person by a window, contemplating life, and it's raining outside, and 3 pages go by and you're wondering, why am I doing this? There are passages in the Odyssey that at first glance don't look necessary. So we get this catalog, line 100. This guy knows exactly what Odysseus owned. 12 herds of cattle on the mainland, 12 of sheep, 12 of pigs, 12 goats, on and on and on. Now, he laments having to cook for the suitors who are just using Odysseus's livestock, but in cattle and such. But don't you think it's interesting that he knows all this? Like, he knows Odysseus so well that he can sort of describe his property in vivid detail. So I would just mark that. I think that's a sign of closeness and respect. So if you go to line 121 on the next page, Odysseus plays dumb and says, who is this person you're talking about, Odysseus? And Eumaeus, just in this long description, if you start around line 131, he says, in reality, my master's skin has been ripped off his bones by birds of prey and dogs. His life is gone. Or he's been eaten by fish. His bones are lying upon the beach, heaped high with sand. His death is ruin for us all, especially me, since I'll never have so kind a master. And then at the end of that paragraph on the next page, it says this beautiful thing. This guy couldn't be further away, really, in status. But he says, a few lines down on page 337, I would prefer to call him brother, even when he's far away, because he's loved and cared for by me with so much kindness. I tell my students now, please write in the margins, dramatic irony, because we're in that position, almost like a god, right? We can stand above this world and notice what's going on, even when characters don't. He doesn't realize that he's talking to the person he's talking about. He's talking to Odysseus himself. He's talking to Odysseus, and he's not aware of it. Odysseus promises on line 162, and we know he can make this promise for obvious reasons. On line 162, he says to the swineherd, Odysseus will come. This is again Odysseus talking as a anonymous sort of beggar. Odysseus will come within this very cycle of the moon, between the waning and the waxing time. He will come home and pay back all those here who disrespect his wife and noble son. So that's really interesting, that the first mortal that has a glimpse of what's to come isn't Penelope, isn't Telemachus, isn't any of the suitors, isn't any upper class locals. It's the guy who takes care of pigs. So in that preliminary conversation is who hasn't had a real strong voice yet. I think this is a really interesting moment in literature in general, where someone like him gets such an important role. So then, I'm not going to read this whole thing now, but if you go to line 191, it's the middle of page 338. We get Odysseus is another version of his autobiography, right? And we know he's not going to tell the complete truth. A, because yeah, he's a liar, but B, this isn't the time for people to know who he is yet. He's saving his time just for the exact right moment to get what he wants. And what does he want? To be reunited with his wife, to see his son, to destroy the suitors, and to sort of start over again in Ithaca. And now's not the time to make that happen. He says in 191, I'll tell you the truth, the whole truth, and then proceeds to tell a bunch of half-truths. He says in line 199 that he comes from Crete, so he's actually from Ithaca. He says in 202, my mother was a slave, bought as a concubine, like an official prostitute of an upper-class person. So none of this is true. He does say on 216, I have the gift of courage from Athena and from Ares. So I would just encourage you, this is page 338, 339, 340, and 341, 342. And it ends, you can mark it, you can put a line under the stanza in the middle of page 343. I actually wrote in my book, this is the end of Odysseus's story. So Odysseus is the storyteller. Pay attention to the details, and I'd encourage you to mark up your book here with this question in mind. What aspects of this fake autobiography are actually true? It's really interesting. He's not telling a completely fictitious story, and he's not going to telling a completely true story. So I'd encourage you to think about that. And then, if you go to 386, Eumaeus responds. And he says, and again, this, we see this in a lot of great literature. We see this in Shakespeare all over the place. We see this in Dickens, where an unexpected, poor, marginalized person, often uneducated, has unique smarts, wisdom, and insight. And maybe that starts with Homer. Maybe Homer knew something. 386, this poor man who takes care of pigs says, a god has brought you here. But don't try to trick me or make nice with lies. I'll be kind to you, old man, not for your stories, but in fear of Zeus, the god of strangers, and because I feel pity for you. So he doesn't know it's Odysseus yet. He doesn't actually believe it's realistic that Odysseus is alive, and it's really not, to be honest, on the surface of things. But this caregiver for pigs knows that there's something supernatural at play, that this story that's being told, and this guy landing in Ithaca when he did, sitting with the swineherd, there's sort of heavenly agency at play. And I just think that's really interesting that he's aware of that. Something to think about at this chapter. First, again, if one were to give homework and to do some journaling or to have a conversation in a reading group, really discuss Odysseus's autobiography to Eumaeus. He's obviously hiding his real identity, but how much of the truth comes out? Is he letting his guard down a little bit? And then I'd like to connect this chapter to maybe the entire book, which is that idea of being a good Greek. All the things involved with being a good Greek, whether it's Senia, whether it's piety. How is Eumaeus a good Greek? Find moments where he's a good Greek, according to the definitions set out by the Odyssey. And one might make the case that he is actually the best of all the Greeks we've seen so far. And if that's true, that's really interesting, because we've met the richest man in the world. We've met heroes, we've met villains. That if he's the best Greek we've seen so far, that's a really interesting statement. So that's just a little introduction to book 14. I hope this is helpful, and happy reading.